A rusted, gutted gas station, two bored kids with shovels, and a half-frozen suitcase no one was meant to see. The snow had formed a pristine blanket over Oakidge, Montana, population 3,512, coating the abandoned Copper Creek station in winter white. The old place stood like a sentinel at the edge of town, its once proud sign hanging at a precarious angle, a relic from a bygone era when copper mines brought prosperity to these mountains. December 2022. 22 years since Rebecca Martinez vanished without a footprint the winter before graduation. 22 years since a small Hispanic girl with serious eyes and a book perpetually tucked under her arm walked into the night and disappeared. 22 years of whispers at town potlucks, of averted gazes when Carmen Martinez passed by at the grocery store before she finally left town, of Sheriff Garrett Mitchell assuring everyone that sometimes teenagers just run away. 22 years until yesterday. The wind cut sharp across Morgan Reynolds' face as she stood at her father's grave. Not his actual grave, not yet, but the land where he would someday rest. Calvin Reynolds, 72, 6 feet of weathered grit and Vietnam memories, sat in his faded armchair, back at the house, dying by inches from the pancreatic cancer he'd hidden from her for months. "You shouldn't be out in this cold," she muttered to herself, her voice carried away by the Montana wind. She'd come to the ridge that overlooked the property, her childhood home, with its weathered 2-story farmhouse, the barn in need of fresh paint, and beyond it the hollow shell of Copper Creek Station. Her father's gas station opened in 1975 when returning veterans were still viewed with suspicion, closed abruptly in 2000 after operating for 25 years. The station where Rebecca Martinez was last seen alive. Morgan pulled her phone from her pocket, pressed record, and began speaking in her precise, measured cadence, the voice that had carried her national investigator podcast to unexpected success. Each year, approximately 600,000 Americans are reported missing. Most are found. Rebecca Martinez wasn't one of them. She paused, looking down at the station. 22 years ago, in a town with one blinking stoplight, a 17-year-old honor student vanished 2 months before graduation. The official story: she ran away. The truth lies buried beneath 2 decades of silence, and I'm about to dig it up. Morgan stopped the recording, staring at the file on her screen. This wasn't just another cold case for her podcast. This was personal. This was home. Her phone rang. Logan, her 12-year-old son. She answered immediately. "Mom, Grandpa's looking for you. He says dinner's almost ready, and he made his famous meatloaf." She smiled despite herself. "Tell him I'll be right down." "Are you at the lookout? Can I come up there sometime? Abby's driving me crazy with her dolls." "Maybe tomorrow if the weather holds. We've got all 3 weeks to explore." "Awesome. Hey, is it true Grandpa has a Harley in the barn?" Morgan chuckled. "Among other treasures. We'll investigate tomorrow." "Sweet, hurry back. I'm starving." As she walked back toward the house, Morgan's mind churned with questions. Why had her father suddenly invited them for Christmas after 8 years of strained phone calls and brief summer visits? Why had he finally revealed his diagnosis now, when doctors gave him only months to live? And why had he warned her in that cryptic phone call 3 weeks ago? Some things are stirring up again in Oakidge. Some things best left buried. The farmhouse windows glowed golden against the gathering dusk. Through the kitchen window, Morgan could see her father at the stove, 9-year-old Abby perched on a stool beside him, solemnly stirring something in a bowl. Logan was setting the table, his gangly preteen frame reminiscent of her younger brother who died in a car accident 20 years ago. This could have been a scene from a Hallmark movie, the reunion of a broken family, the bittersweet homecoming for the holidays. Except Morgan Reynolds hadn't come home merely to reconcile with her dying father. She'd come to unearth the truth about Rebecca Martinez. What she didn't know was how deeply her father was entangled in that truth. "How's that fancy podcast of yours doing?" Calvin asked, passing the mashed potatoes across the dinner table. Despite the cancer hollowing him from within, his hands remained steady, the hands of a mechanic, a veteran, a man who'd built a life from nothing but grit and determination. "We just hit 5 million downloads," Morgan replied, watching as Logan heaped a small mountain of potatoes onto his plate. "The episode on the Lake Michigan disappearances went viral." Calvin nodded, his weathered face revealing nothing. "Your mother would have been proud. She always said you had a nose for the truth." Is that why you became a journalist, Mom? Abby asked carefully, cutting her meatloaf into precise squares. Because of Grandma, Morgan exchanged a glance with her father. Partly, I also couldn't stand not knowing the ending to stories. Like Rebecca Martinez. Calvin's fork paused halfway to his mouth. The table went silent. Logan and Abby exchanged glances, sensing the sudden tension. You know, Morgan said carefully, Oakidge is small. Word travels fast, especially when Sheriff Mitchell's involved. Calvin's voice carried an edge she couldn't quite decipher. He called yesterday, asked if you were coming for Christmas. And what did you tell him? The truth, that my daughter and grandkids were visiting for the holidays. He took a deliberate bite of meatloaf. Nothing more. Morgan studied her father's face, the deep lines around his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw. Calvin Reynolds had never been an easy man to read, a trait that had served him well in Vietnam, and later as a small business owner in a town where everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did. Who's Rebecca Martinez? Logan asked, his adolescent curiosity piqued. Morgan opened her mouth to answer, but Calvin spoke first. A girl who went missing my last year, running the station. Sad business. Never solved. He turned to Logan. Your mom fancy herself solving the case after all these years. That's what Mom does, Abby said proudly. She finds answers for people who don't have them. Calvin's expression softened as he looked at his granddaughter. Sometimes a little lady there are no answers, just empty spaces where they should be. Later, after the kids had gone upstairs to unpack, Morgan found her father in his study, the room unchanged since her childhood. The worn leather chair, the bookshelves lined with Louis L'Amour westerns and Vietnam histories, the display case containing his medals, and the folded flag from her mother's funeral. He was staring at an old photograph, the edges worn from handling. Morgan recognized it immediately, the grand opening of Copper Creek Station, 1975. Her father standing proudly in front of the newly painted building, her mother beside him, pregnant with Morgan, and at the edge of the frame, a tall man in a sheriff's uniform, Frank Mitchell Garrett's father. You didn't come back just for me, did you? Calvin asked without looking up. I came back because my father is dying, Morgan said, leaning against the doorframe. The podcast is secondary. Bullshit. The word had no heat behind it. You came back because Carmen Martinez returned to town last month, making noise about reopening the investigation. Morgan felt her pulse quicken. Carmen's back. You didn't mention that on the phone? Didn't think I needed to. Calvin finally looked up, his blue eyes so like her own sharp, despite the pain medication she knew he was taking. Figured you already knew, investigative journalist that you are. Dad, let it rest, Morgan. His voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. Some stones are better left unturned. Is that what you've been doing for 22 years, leaving stones unturned? Calvin carefully returned the photograph to the desk drawer. I've been living with the choices I made, good and bad. He stood slowly, his movements betraying the pain he tried to hide. You have children now. You understand about protecting them. I also understand about justice, about truth. Truth, he almost spat the word. Truth is rarely pure and never simple. Oscar Wilde said that. You're quoting Wilde now. Morgan couldn't help but smile despite the tension. I read. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. Your mother's influence. He moved past her toward the doorway, then paused, placing a hand on her shoulder. Up close, she could see how the illness had diminished him, this man who had once seemed indestructible to her. Promise me something, he said softly. Keep the kids away from the station. It's not safe. The structure's unstable. A shadow crossed his face. Among other things. Before she could press further, the sound of footsteps thundered down the stairs. Mom, Grandpa. Logan's voice carried the unmistakable excitement of discovery. Come and see what we found in the attic. The discovery was a bah of cassette tapes, dozens of them, each meticulously labeled in her mother's handwriting. Folk music, classic rock, recorded books, and homemade mixtapes spanning decades. Can we listen to them? Abby asked, holding up a tape labeled Summer '82. If we can find something to play them on, Morgan replied. These are ancient technology, guys. I've got an old boombox in the hall closet, Calvin said. Still works, I think. As her father went to retrieve it, Morgan examined the box more closely. Most of the tapes were from before her birth or during her early childhood, her mother's collection preserved like artifacts from another time. One tape caught her eye. Unlike the others, it had no label, just a small piece of masking tape with DM written in handwriting that wasn't her mother's. Calvin returned with a dusty Sony boombox, setting it on the kitchen table. Battery's probably dead, but it works on AC power. He plugged it in, pressed the eject button, and the cassette deck popped open. What do you want to hear first? This one, Logan said, grabbing a tape labeled Road Trip Jams 94. Was this yours, Mom? Probably. Morgan smiled, remembering long drives with her parents, the soundtrack of Eagles and Fleetwood Mac playing as mountains rolled past the windows. They spent the evening listening to the ghosts of the past, Calvin occasionally sharing stories behind certain songs, the kids laughing at the ancient technology and the music their mother had once loved. For a few hours, they were just a family reuniting for Christmas, the specter of illness and old secrets temporarily at bay. It was nearly midnight when the kids finally went to bed, exhausted from the long drive and the excitement of exploration. Morgan found herself alone in the kitchen with her father, who was nursing a glass of bourbon against doctor's orders, she was certain. She loved music, Calvin said softly, his gaze distant. Your mother could name any song within 3 notes. I remember. Morgan poured herself a finger of bourbon and sat across from him. Dad, about the station? Not tonight. He drained his glass. Please. Then tell me about Sheriff Mitchell. Why did he ask if I was coming to town? Calvin's expression hardened. Garrett's been sheriff since his father retired in 2008, runs this county like his personal fiefdom, just like Frank did before him. And you two were friends once? It wasn't a question. Business associates, Calvin corrected. Frank Mitchell was nobody's friend, just a man who collected favors like some men collect coins. And his son, Calvin studied his empty glass, worse in his way, smoother, more educated, but cut from the same cloth. He looked up, his eyes suddenly intense. Don't trust him, Morgan. No matter how charming he seems, no matter what he says. Garrett Mitchell is not a man who lets anything threaten his position in this town. Is that a warning or a confession? Her father's silence was answer enough. Morgan woke before dawn, the old house creaking around her as it settled in the cold. Her childhood bedroom remained largely unchanged, the same purple bedspread, the Build-A-Bear board still displaying faded concert tickets and photos of high school friends. Among them, a group picture from Oakidge High's class of 2025, smiling faces, including a serious-eyed girl with long dark hair standing slightly apart from the others. Rebecca Martinez. Slipping from bed, Morgan pulled on sweatpants and a heavy sweater, grabbed her phone, and made her way quietly downstairs. The kitchen was dark, but a light glowed from beneath the door of her father's study. Despite the early hours, she wasn't surprised to find him awake. Pain had a way of making night interminable. She paused, hearing the low murmur of his voice. He was on the phone, his tone urgent but hushed. She's asking questions already. Yes, about the station. No, I haven't told her anything. Morgan moved closer, careful to avoid the creaking floorboard outside the study door. I understand, yes. No, I won't, but Garrett, you have to realize this can't stay buried forever. Garrett, Sheriff Mitchell. Fine, tomorrow at noon, the usual place. A pause. I hope you're right, for all our sakes. The call ended, followed by a heavy sigh. Morgan retreated silently to the kitchen before her father could discover her eavesdropping. She busied herself making coffee, her mind racing with questions. What couldn't stay buried forever? What had her father hidden at the sheriff's behest? By the time Calvin emerged from his study, Morgan had composed herself, sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming mug and her laptop open. You're up early, he observed, moving to the coffee pot. Old habits. She gestured to her laptop, working on the next podcast episode. About Rebecca, his back was to her as he poured his coffee. No, the lie came easily. About a cold case in Oregon. He nodded, seemingly satisfied, and joined her at the table. They sat in companionable silence for a while, two early risers accustomed to solitude in the pre-dawn hours. I've got a doctor's appointment in town at 10, Calvin finally said. Then some errands. Thought I'd be back around 4. Any plans with the kids today? Thought we'd explore the property a bit if the weather holds. Logan's dying to see that Harley you've got stashed in the barn. A smile touched her father's lips. That old thing. Haven't ridden it in years. Keys are hanging in the mudroom if you want to show him. He'll be thrilled. Morgan hesitated. Dad, about the station. What did I just say last night? The warmth vanished from his voice. You said not to let the kids near it. You didn't say why. Structure's unstable. Roof could collapse any minute. That reason enough for you? It wasn't, but Morgan recognized the stubborn set of her father's jaw. He wouldn't yield any more information, not now at least. Fine, we'll stay away from the dangerous, mysterious gas station, where you're definitely not hiding any deep, dark family secrets. She kept her tone light, teasing. Calvin didn't smile. Some mysteries should stay mysterious, Morgan, for everyone's sake. The day dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter morning where the air feels like crystal and sounds carry for miles. After breakfast, Morgan bundled up the kids and led them outside to explore the 20 acres of land that had been in the Reynolds family for 3 generations. How far to the creek, Mom? Logan asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. About a quarter-mile through those trees. Morgan pointed to the tree line beyond the barn. It marks the property boundary. The Hendersons own the land on the other side. Can we go see if it's frozen? Abby's face was nearly hidden beneath her wool hat, only her eager eyes visible. Sure, but stay where I can see you. As the kids ran ahead, Morgan felt a wave of nostalgia wash over her. How many winter mornings had she spent exploring these same woods, building snow forts, or sliding across the frozen creek before her brother's death, before her mother's cancer, before the fault lines in her family cracked wide open in the wake of Rebecca Martinez's disappearance. They spent the morning following the meandering path of the creek, Morgan pointing out places where she used to play as a child. The frozen water provided entertainment as they slid stones across its glassy surface and admired the intricate patterns of ice along the edges. For a few hours, Morgan allowed herself to relax, to see Oakidge through her children's eyes as a place of discovery rather than secrets. But as the sun climbed higher, she found her gaze repeatedly drawn back toward the house and the hulking shadow of Copper Creek Station beyond it. What was her father discussing with Sheriff Mitchell at this very moment? What had been buried for 22 years that suddenly threatened to surface? Mom, look at this, Logan called from several yards ahead. Morgan pushed through the snow to where her son knelt beside a massive fallen tree, partially hollowed by rotten weather. It's like a natural fort, he explained, pointing to the space beneath the trunk. Abby could totally fit inside. It's creepy, Abby declared, though she was already examining the hollow space with interest. I used to have a hideout like this, Morgan said, running her gloved hand along the rough bark. Further up the creek, though, there was an old oak with a split trunk perfect for hiding treasures. Did you have secret treasures? Abby asked, wide-eyed. Of course. Arrowheads I found, special rocks, notes from friends. Morgan smiled at the memory. A diary my mother gave me that I didn't want my brother to find. Can we make this our secret hideout? Logan asked. For the next 3 weeks, it's all yours. As the children began clearing snow from the hollow, Morgan's phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number, local area code. Morgan Reynolds, she answered, moving a few steps away from the kids. Miss Reynolds? A man's voice deep with a slight Montana drawl. Sheriff Garrett Mitchell. Hope I'm not disturbing your family time. Morgan's spine stiffened. Not at all, Sheriff. What can I do for you? Just wanted to welcome you back to Oakidge. Your father mentioned you'd be visiting for the holidays. That's right. I understand you're in the podcast business now. True crime is it. His tone was conversational, but Morgan detected the underlying tension. Among other things, fascinating field. If you're interested, I'd be happy to show you around the department while you're in town. We've modernized quite a bit since you left. That's very kind of you, Sheriff. Call me Garrett, please. We were in school together, after all. 3 years apart, and they'd barely interacted, but Morgan didn't correct him. I'll keep your offer in mind. We're pretty busy with family activities this trip. Of course, of course. Family comes first. A pause. I was sorry to hear about your father's condition. Calvin's been a fixture in this town for as long as I can remember. Yes, he has. Well, I won't keep you. Enjoy your stay in Oakidge, Morgan. And if you need anything at all, my door is always open. The call ended, leaving Morgan with a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. Sheriff Mitchell was marking his territory, making it clear he knew why she was in town and warning her off. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, turning to check on the kids. They had moved further up the creek, Logan showing Abby how to test the ice's thickness with a stick. Time for lunch, she called. Then maybe we'll check out that motorcycle in the barn. The motorcycle was exactly where Calvin had said it would be, hidden beneath a canvas tarp in the corner of the barn. Logan helped Morgan pull the covering away, revealing a vintage 1970 Harley-Davidson Sportster, its black paint and chrome accents dusty but intact. Whoa, Logan breathed, circling the machine reverently. This is so cool. Does it still work? Your grandfather said it does. Morgan ran her hand along the handlebars, remembering the summer her father had taught her to ride. She'd been 16, reckless and hungry for freedom. The Harley had been her escape route during those turbulent teenage years. Can we start it? Logan's eyes pleaded. Not today, bud, but maybe before we leave, if Grandpa says it's okay. They spent the afternoon exploring the barn, a treasury of Reynolds family history. Calvin's old tools hung neatly on pegboards. A partially restored 1967 Ford Mustang sat in the center bay, engine parts meticulously organized on a nearby workbench, and the walls were adorned with vintage signs and license plates Calvin had collected over decades. In the corner, furthest from the door, Morgan discovered her father's gun cabinet, locked as it had always been, but still displaying the impressive collection through its glass doors. Hunting rifles, shotguns, and a few handguns, all maintained with the same care Calvin showed to everything he owned. Is Grandpa a hunter? Abby asked, peering at the guns with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He used to be, Morgan answered. Not so much anymore. What she didn't say was that her father hadn't hunted since returning from Vietnam. The guns were kept for protection and sport shooting, a hobby he'd maintained through membership in the local gun club, where he'd regularly outshot men 20 years his junior. As the afternoon light began to fade, Morgan checked her watch. Nearly 4, her father would be returning soon. Let's head back to the house, she suggested. Help Grandpa with dinner. Can we explore more tomorrow? Logan asked. Definitely. We've barely scratched the surface. As they walked back toward the house, Abby tugged at Morgan's sleeve. Mom, what's that building over there? She pointed beyond the house where the faded outline of Copper Creek Station was visible against the winter sky. That's your grandfather's old gas station, Morgan replied carefully. He ran it for many years before it closed. Can we see inside? No, honey, it's not safe. The building is very old and could be dangerous. But Abby, Morgan's tone brooked no argument. The station is off limits. Understand? The little girl nodded reluctantly, and they continued toward the house in silence. As they approached, Morgan noticed a sheriff's department SUV parked in the driveway beside her father's truck. Sheriff Mitchell had come calling, after all. Morgan ushered the children inside through the back door, instructing them to wash up for dinner while she went to find her father. Voices drifted from the study, Calvin's and another man's, their tones low and urgent. She's bound to find out eventually, her father was saying. She's not going to let this go, Garrett. Then make her, Sheriff Mitchell's voice was steel-wrapped in silk, for her own good, for the kids' safety. Threats, Garrett, really. Not threats, Calvin. Facts. You know what happens if this gets out. The damage it would do to the town, to your family. To mine. It's been 22 years. Maybe it's time. Time for what? To destroy everything we've built, to let that woman drag Rebecca's name through the mud with her wild theories. Morgan stepped back from the door, processing what she'd heard. Carmen Martinez had theories about her daughter's disappearance, theories that threatened both the sheriff and her father. The study door opened abruptly, and Sheriff Garrett Mitchell emerged, stopping short when he saw Morgan in the hallway. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to authority. His brown hair was shot with distinguished silver at the temples, his uniform crisp and perfectly pressed. Ms. Reynolds, he recovered smoothly. What a pleasant surprise. I was just checking in on your father after his appointment today. Sheriff, Morgan kept her expression neutral. Twice in 1 month. I'm flattered by the attention. Mitchell's smile didn't reach his eyes. Small-town hospitality. We look after our own here in Oakidge. Calvin appeared in the doorway behind him, his face drawn with fatigue. Morgan, I didn't hear you come in. Are the kids with you? Upstairs washing up. She didn't take her eyes off Mitchell. The sheriff was just leaving, I think. Indeed I was, Mitchell nodded to Calvin. Think about what I said, Cal. For everyone's sake. He turned back to Morgan. Enjoy your stay, Ms. Reynolds. Remember, my door is always open if you need anything. After Mitchell left, Morgan followed her father into the study. What was that about? Calvin sank into his leather chair, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. Town business, nothing for you to worry about. He mentioned Carmen Martinez, said she had wild theories about Rebecca. Eavesdropping now. Her father's tone was sharp. That's beneath you, Morgan. So is lying to your daughter. She perched on the edge of his desk. What theories, Dad? What is Carmen saying that has the sheriff so worried? Calvin rubbed a hand over his face. Carmen believes Rebecca didn't run away, that she was, he hesitated, harmed by someone in town. And what do you believe? Her father's eyes met hers, and in them, Morgan saw a depth of pain that transcended his physical illness. I believe some ghosts should be left to rest. Rebecca isn't a ghost, Dad. She was a 17-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her. She deserves justice. Justice, Calvin's laugh was hollow. You sound just like your mother. Before Morgan could respond, the thunder of footsteps on the stairs announced the children's arrival. The conversation was over for now. But as she helped prepare dinner, Morgan's mind kept returning to the exchange between her father and the sheriff. What were they hiding? What had happened to Rebecca Martinez that needed to remain buried after all these years? And most troubling, dinner was a strained affair. Calvin seemed distracted, his gaze often drifting toward the window where the outline of Copper Creek Station was visible in the gathering dusk. The children, sensing the tension, were unusually subdued, answering their grandfather's occasional questions about school and friends with minimal enthusiasm. After the meal, Calvin excused himself to rest the day's activities, having clearly taken a toll. Morgan shooed the kids into the living room to watch a movie while she cleaned up the kitchen, using the solitude to gather her thoughts. Her father was hiding something significant about Rebecca's disappearance, something that involved Sheriff Mitchell and possibly Mitchell's father as well. Carmen Martinez had returned to town with theories that threatened to expose whatever had been concealed for over 2 decades. And at the center of it all stood Copper Creek Station, the site where Rebecca was last seen alive. Morgan dried the last dish and stared out the window at the darkened silhouette of the station. Her father had warned her away. Mitchell had threatened vague consequences, and every instinct told her that the answers she sought lay within those weathered walls. She needed to see inside. Tonight. After ensuring the kids were engrossed in their movie and her father was asleep, Morgan slipped into her coat and boots. She left through the back door, the frigid night air biting at her exposed skin as she crossed the yard toward the station. The building stood silent against the star-filled sky, its abandoned pumps like sentinels guarding forgotten memories. Morgan circled to the side, looking for any point of entry. The main doors were padlocked, the windows boarded up years ago. But at the back, she discovered a door with a broken padlock hanging uselessly from the hasp. Using her phone's flashlight, Morgan pushed the door open, wincing at the groan of protesting hinges. The air inside was stale and heavy with dust. Weak moonlight filtered through the cracks between the boards, covering the windows, supplementing her flashlight beam. The main room was largely empty, save for a few broken shelves and an ancient cash register with its drawer hanging open. Old promotional signs for Marlboro cigarettes and Coca-Cola hung askew on the walls, their colors faded to ghostly impressions of their former brightness. Morgan moved carefully through the space, her light playing across the dusty floor. Something caught her eye: footprints in the dust, recent ones leading toward a door at the back of the station. Her father's study wasn't the only place Sheriff Mitchell had visited today. The back room had once been her father's office. Unlike the main area, it wasn't entirely empty. A metal desk still stood against one wall, its surface covered in dust and mouse droppings. A filing cabinet lay on its side drawers, open and empty. And in the center of the room, a rectangular patch of floor was slightly different from the surrounding boards, newer, less worn. Morgan knelt, examining the replaced section. The boards were loose in one corner. Using a pen from her pocket, she pried up the edge, revealing a shallow space beneath. Inside lay a metal strongbox, roughly the size of a thick novel. Her heart pounding, and Morgan lifted the box and tried the lid. Locked. Of course it would be locked. She tucked it under her arm and continued exploring the room, her light scanning each corner methodically. Near the desk, something glinted on the floor. Morgan bent to examine it, a small silver earring in the shape of a butterfly. She picked it up, turning it over in her palm. The butterfly's delicate wings were tarnished with age, but unmistakably similar to the pair Rebecca Martinez wore in her senior photo. As Morgan pocketed the earring, a sound from the main room froze her in place, the creak of the back door opening. Someone else had entered the station. Morgan quickly switched off her flashlight, plunging the office into darkness. She crouched behind the desk, clutching the metal box to her chest, straining to hear over the pounding of her heart. Footsteps moved deliberately across the main room, accompanied by the sweep of a flashlight beam. The footsteps paused at the office door. "I know you're in here, Morgan." Her father's voice gravelly with age and illness, but unmistakable. Morgan stood slowly, switching her light back on. Calvin stood in the doorway, his own flashlight casting strange shadows across his weathered face. "How did you know?" she asked. "Because you're your mother's daughter. Too curious for your own good." His gaze dropped to the box in her hands. "I see you found it." "Found what exactly?" "It's locked." Calvin sighed, leaning against the doorframe. He suddenly looked very old, very tired. "That's for the best, believe me. No more cryptic warnings, Dad. I want the truth. What happened to Rebecca Martinez? Why are you and Sheriff Mitchell so determined to keep it buried?" "Because some truths destroy more than they heal." He gestured to the box. "Put it back, Morgan. Please, for your children's sake, if not your own." "My children." A chill ran down her spine. "Are you threatening my kids?" "No, Iti." The word came out as a whisper. "I'm trying to protect them. To protect you, the same way I tried to protect Rebecca." "Tried to protect?" Morgan's mind raced. "Dad, did you know what was going to happen to her?" Calvin's silence was damning. "Oh my God." Morgan felt sick. "Were you involved in her disappearance?" "Not the way you think." Calvin's voice was hollow. "I didn't harm that girl, but I failed her all the same." Before Morgan could respond, a new sound cut through the night, a vehicle approaching on the gravel driveway. Headlights swept across the boarded windows, illuminating the dust motes swirling in the air. "Damn it," Calvin muttered. "He followed me." "Mitchell." Her father nodded grimly. "Get out, now, through the side window in the storage room. It's not boarded up." "Dad." "Go, Morgan. Take the box if you must, but go. And whatever you do, don't trust Garrett Mitchell. Not with this, not with anything." The front door of the station rattled as someone tried the padlock. "I'll stall him," Calvin whispered. "Just go." Heart pounding, Morgan slipped past her father into a small storage room she hadn't noticed before. As promised, a narrow window high on the wall was unboarded. She set the box on a shelf, climbed onto an overturned bucket, and pushed the window open, grimacing at the screech of metal against metal. "Calvin!" Mitchell's voice carried from the front of the station. "That you in there?" Morgan hoisted herself up and through the window landing with a soft thud in the snow outside. Clutching the metal box to her chest, she pressed herself against the wall of the station listening. "Evening, Sheriff." Her father's voice was casual, unhurried. "Bit late for a social call, isn't it? Saw your truck. Wondered what business you might have here at this hour." "My station, my business." "Is that so? Thought I made it clear this place was off limits, for everyone's safety." "I've never been good at following orders, Garrett. You know that." Their voices faded as they moved deeper into the building. Morgan seized the opportunity, pushing away from the wall and moving swiftly through the shadows toward the house. The metal box was cold against her chest, its contents a mystery that might finally shed light on Rebecca Martinez's fate and her father's role in it. She had nearly reached the back porch when the station door slammed open behind her. Sheriff Mitchell's voice cut through the night. "Morgan Reynolds, stop right there." But Morgan was already inside, locking the door behind her. Through the kitchen window, she watched as Mitchell strode angrily back to the station, presumably to confront her father again. Upstairs, she could hear the muffled sounds of the movie still playing, the children unaware of the drama unfolding outside. Morgan quickly hid the metal box in her suitcase, then went to check on Logan and Abby. They were both asleep on the couch, the credits of the movie rolling across the screen. As she gently woke them and guided them upstairs to bed, Morgan's mind raced with questions. What was in the box? What had her father meant about trying to protect Rebecca? And most troubling of all, what would Sheriff Mitchell do now that he knew Morgan was investigating? One thing was certain: whatever secrets Copper Creek Station held, they were dangerous enough that powerful men had conspired to keep them buried for 22 years. And now that she'd begun digging, Morgan knew she wouldn't stop until she uncovered the truth, no matter the cost. The next morning dawned gray and threatening snow. Morgan woke early, the events of the previous night weighing heavily on her mind. She'd slept fitfully, the metal box hidden beneath her bed like a ticking bomb. Her father's truck was gone from the driveway, Another early morning appointment, perhaps, or more likely an attempt to avoid the confrontation he knew was coming. Morgan used the opportunity to examine her find more closely. The box was made of steel solid and surprisingly heavy for its size. The lock was simple, a basic tumbler mechanism that might yield to the right tools. After searching through her father's desk, Morgan found a small screwdriver and a paper clip, which she straightened and bent into a crude lockpick. It took nearly 20 minutes of careful manipulation before the lock finally clicked open. Inside, Morgan found several items carefully preserved in plastic: a small notebook with a faded floral cover, a cassette tape labeled only with the initials RM, a silver necklace with a butterfly pendant that matched the earrings she'd found, and a folded piece of paper. Morgan's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. It was a note written in a careful, precise hand. "If anything happens to me, look for the red truck. He thinks no one knows about it, but I've seen him watching me from inside. This is my insurance, Rebecca M." The red truck. Morgan remembered Carmen Martinez mentioning it in news interviews years ago, a red Ford pickup that had been seen near the library where Rebecca worked in the weeks before her disappearance. The police had dismissed it as irrelevant at the time. Next, Morgan examined the notebook. It was a diary, the entries spanning from September 1999 to March 2000, the month Rebecca disappeared. She began reading her journalist's mind, cataloging details, even as her heart ached for the young girl whose thoughts lay preserved on these pages. The early entries were typical teenage musings, complaints about homework, excitement about college applications, observations about classmates and teachers. But as Morgan read further, the tone changed. February 12, 2000. Someone followed me home from work tonight. I could hear footsteps behind me, but whenever I turned around, they would stop. When I got to my street, I ran the last block. Mom wasn't home yet. I locked all the doors and windows. February 20th, 2000. Got another note in my locker today. Third one this month. This one said, "I see you when you don't see me." Should I tell Mom she's already working double shifts to save for my college tuition? Don't want to worry her. March 3rd, 2000. The calls have started again. Heavy breathing, then they hang up. I star 69 the last one, but it came back as the sheriff's station. Probably just a wrong number. Morgan's blood ran cold at that entry. Calls from the sheriff's station. Could be coincidence, but March 10th, 2000. Deputy Mitchell talked to me today. Said he'd noticed I seemed nervous lately. When I told him about the notes and the phone calls, he said he could help me. Said sometimes girls my age attract unwanted attention, and he could make sure I stayed safe. Morgan felt a chill run down her spine. Not Garrett Mitchell, who would have been in his 20s then, but his father, Frank Mitchell, the sheriff at the time. March 15, 2000. Sheriff Mitchell asked me to meet him at the station tonight to discuss a plan. Said he thinks he knows who's behind the harassment, but can't confront them directly because they're someone of influence. Told me not to tell anyone, not even Mom or Deputy Hawkins. Said it could compromise the investigation. March 20th, 2000. Meeting FM tonight at 11:00 am at Copper Creek. Mr. Reynolds closes up at 10 so the place will be empty. FM says he has proof now and we can take it to the state police together. Finally, someone who believes me. I'm scared, but hopeful. If something happens to me, remember the red truck belongs to him. This was the final entry. Rebecca had planned to meet Frank Mitchell, then the sheriff, at her father's gas station the night she disappeared. And she'd been afraid enough to leave a clue: the red truck. The cassette tape. With trembling fingers, Morgan retrieved the boombox they'd used the previous evening. She inserted the tape and pressed play. Static filled the room. Then a young female voice, hesitant, frightened. "I'm making this recording as evidence. It's March 20th, 2000. My name is Rebecca Martinez. For the past 2 months, I've been receiving threatening notes and phone calls. At first, I thought it was just a cruel prank, but now I know it's him." The recording cut off abruptly, replaced by what sounded like a struggle with the objects, falling, a muffled cry, then silence. Morgan sat frozen, the implications crashing over her like a wave. Rebecca had been recording evidence against someone who had interrupted her before she could name them. Had she managed to hide the tape before being taken? Or had someone else found it afterward and preserved it as evidence? Her father's words echoed in her mind. I tried to protect Rebecca. What had he meant? Had he known about the harassment? Had he found the tape after her disappearance? And most chilling of all, had Frank Mitchell, the former sheriff, been Rebecca's stalker rather than her protector? The sound of a door closing downstairs jolted Morgan from her thoughts. She quickly returned the items to the box and slid it under her bed. Then she went to wake the children, her mind racing with new questions and theories. Whoever had stalked and likely killed Rebecca Martinez had connections to the sheriff's department, and her father somehow was entangled in the aftermath. Whether as an accomplice or a reluctant witness remained to be seen. One thing was certain: Morgan Reynolds had just scratched the surface of a conspiracy that had been festering in Oakidge for 22 years. And now that she'd begun to uncover the truth, there was no turning back, even if that truth implicated her own father. The game had changed. It was no longer just about solving a cold case for her podcast. It was about justice for Rebecca Martinez, and perhaps in some way redemption for Calvin Reynolds. But first, Morgan needed to find Carmen Martinez and share what she'd discovered. Together, they might finally piece together the full story of what happened that night at Copper Creek Station and who was responsible for silencing a 17-year-old girl who knew too much. The storm was about to break in more ways than one. By the time Morgan and the children came downstairs for breakfast, Calvin had returned. He sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee, his expression unreadable. The scent of bacon filled the air. "Morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Made breakfast." Logan and Abby raced to the table, oblivious to the tension between the adults. Morgan poured herself coffee, studying her father over the rim of her mug. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes. Had he slept at all after his confrontation with Mitchell? "Any plans for today?" Calvin asked, serving the kids pancakes. "I thought we might go into town," Morgan replied. "Show the kids where I went to school, maybe have lunch at the diner." Calvin nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good idea. Weather should hold until this afternoon." "Where were you so early this morning?" Morgan kept her tone casual. "Doctor's appointment. Blood work." He didn't meet her eyes. Routine stuff. The lie hung between them, as tangible as the scent of coffee and bacon. "What do you say, kids?" Morgan turned to Logan and Abby, ready to see the thriving metropolis of Oakidge. "Can we get milkshakes?" Logan asked through a mouthful of pancake. "Absolutely." "Will we see where the missing girl lived?" Abby's innocent question silenced the table. Calvin's fork clattered against his plate. "Who told you about that?" "I heard you and Mom talking last night," Abby admitted. "You said a girl named Rebecca disappeared." Morgan and Calvin exchanged glances. "Yes," Morgan said carefully, "a long time ago, before you were born." "Did they ever find her?" Logan's curiosity was piqued now. "No," Calvin answered before Morgan could. "They never did." The weight of those 3 words hung in the air like smoke. Morgan felt a surge of determination. They might never have found Rebecca Martinez, but they could still find justice for her. And if that meant uncovering painful truths about her own family, so be it. "We should get ready to go," she told the children. "The diner gets busy around lunchtime." As the kids finished breakfast and went upstairs to dress, Morgan found herself alone with her father. "What happened to Mitchell last night?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "After I left." Calvin's weathered face revealed nothing. "We talked. He left. End of story." "Did he ask about the box?" "He knows you took something. Doesn't know what." Calvin rubbed a hand over his face. "Morgan, you're stirring up a hornet's nest. Mitchell won't let this go. Neither will I." "What's your stake in this? Why protect Mitchell after all these years?" "Who says I'm protecting him?" Calvin's eyes met hers, defiant despite his exhaustion. "Maybe I'm protecting you. Maybe I'm protecting this town from a truth that would tear it apart. Or maybe you're protecting yourself." The accusation hung between them like a drawn knife. "You think you know everything." Calvin's voice was low, dangerous. "You have no idea what happened that night. No idea what choices I had to make." "Then tell me." "Not yet." He stood wincing at the pain the movement caused. "Go to town, show the kids your old school, eat your milkshakes. But be careful who you talk to, Morgan. Not everyone in Oakidge is what they seem." With that cryptic warning, he left the kitchen, ending the conversation as decisively as he'd ended so many in Morgan's childhood. Oakidge hadn't changed much in the years since Morgan had left. Main Street still consisted of a handful of storefronts: the general store, the diner, the bank, and a few small businesses that seemed to change hands every few years. The stoplights at the town's single intersection still blinked yellow after 10 p.m., and the mountains still loomed in the distance, eternal sentinels over the small community. But as Morgan drove slowly down Main Street, pointing out landmarks to her children, she noticed subtle differences. The old movie theater had been converted into a community center, its marquee now announcing town council meetings instead of film titles. Several storefronts stood empty, victims of the economic downturn that had hit rural America hard, and a large modern building stood at the edge of town, the new sheriff's department headquarters built during Garrett Mitchell's tenure. "Is that your school, Mom?" Logan pointed to a red brick building visible beyond the town park. "That's it. Oakidge High, home of the miners." Morgan smiled despite herself. "Want to see it up close?" The school was closed for winter break, but Morgan parked in the empty lot, allowing the kids to press their faces against the glass doors to peer inside at the trophy cases and bulletin boards. "You went here every day?" Abby asked, her breath fogging the glass. "For 4 years." Morgan pointed to a faded banner hanging in the lobby. "See that state debate champions, 1992? I was on that team." "Was Rebecca on your team too?" Logan asked. Morgan shook her head. "She was younger than me, and she worked at the library after school." "Which library?" Logan, his eyes lit with interest. "That one." Morgan pointed across the park to a small, single-story building with wide steps leading to its entrance. "Come on, let's check it out. It should be open." Unlike the school, the Oakidge Public Library was busy despite the holiday season. A group of elderly men sat at a table near the entrance, engaged in what appeared to be their regular chess matches. Several mothers with young children clustered around the children's section, and a few solitary readers occupied armchairs near the windows. The library smelled exactly as Morgan remembered, the distinctive blend of old books, furniture polish, and the coffee that perpetually brewed behind the circulation desk. The layout was familiar too, though the technology had been updated with newer computers and a self-checkout station. "Mom, look," Logan pointed to a bulletin board near the entrance. "It's her." Morgan followed his gaze to a faded poster pinned among community announcements and flyers. Missing the bold letters proclaimed above a photograph of Rebecca Martinez. The girl's serious eyes stared out from the paper, her dark hair framing a face on the cusp of womanhood. "Last seen March 20th, 2000. "Why is that still up after so long?" Morgan murmured, more to herself than to the children. "Because some of us haven't forgotten." The voice came from behind her, female, accented slightly, with the cadence of Mexico City layered over decades in Montana. Morgan turned to find herself face to face with Carmen Martinez. The years had been both kind and cruel to Rebecca's mother. Her once dark hair was now steel gray, worn in a practical bob that framed a face lined with grief, but still beautiful in its resilience. She stood straight, despite her 60-some years' dignity, in every inch of her 5'4" frame. "Mrs. Martinez," Morgan said softly. "I'm Morgan Reynolds." "I know who you are." Carmen's gaze flickered to Logan and Abby, then back to Morgan. "Calvin's daughter, the podcaster." The way she said it, not accusatory but knowing, told Morgan that Carmen had been expecting her. "Yes," Morgan turned to her children. "Guys, this is Mrs. Martinez. She knew me when I was growing up." "Hi," Logan said, suddenly shy. "Hello." Carmen's stern expression softened slightly. "The library has an excellent children's section through that archway," she pointed. "There's a puzzle table and some holiday crafts set up." "Can we, Mom?" Abby asked. Morgan nodded. "Stay where I can see you." As the children moved away, Carmen gestured to a quiet corner with 2 armchairs partially screened by bookshelves. "We should talk." They sat, 2 women connected by a tragedy neither had fully processed, separated by suspicions. Neither had voiced aloud. "I heard you were back in town," Carmen said without preamble. "Recording a podcast about my daughter." "That's not why I came back," Morgan began, but Carmen cut her off with a raised hand. "I don't care why you came back. I care what you know." Her dark eyes, so like her daughter's, fixed on Morgan with laser intensity. "Your father called me last night. Said you'd found something. Something that might help me understand what happened to Rebecca." Morgan's surprise must have shown on her face. "He didn't tell you he called." Carmen's expression was unreadable. "Interesting. We haven't been communicating well lately," Morgan admitted. "Did he say what I found?" "No, just that you'd been asking questions. That things were coming to a head," was how he put it. Carmen leaned forward slightly. So, I'll ask again, what do you know about my daughter's disappearance? Morgan hesitated, weighing her options. She'd come looking for Carmen to share her discoveries, but now found herself uncertain how much to reveal. How much did Carmen already know? What role did she believe Calvin had played, and most importantly, could she be trusted with the full truth? But looking into the eyes of a mother who had spent 22 years searching for answers, Morgan knew she couldn't withhold what she'd found. I found a metal box hidden beneath the floorboards of my father's old office at the gas station, she said quietly. Inside was Rebecca's diary, a cassette recording she made the day she disappeared, and a note warning about a red truck. Carmen inhaled sharply, her composure cracking for the first time. You have her diary. I looked everywhere after She couldn't finish the sentence. Yes, she documented the harassment she was experiencing, someone following her home from work, leaving notes in her locker, making phone calls that she traced back to the sheriff's station. Frank Mitchell. Carmen spat the name like a curse. I knew it was him. I told the state police, but no one would listen. No one believed that the respected sheriff of Oakidge County could be stalking a teenage girl. The diary confirms your suspicions, Morgan said. Rebecca wrote that Sheriff Mitchell approached her claiming he wanted to help her identify her stalker. He arranged to meet her at Copper Creek Station the night she disappeared. And your father, Carmen's question was pointed direct. According to the diary, he wasn't supposed to be there. The meeting was scheduled after closing. Morgan met Carmen's gaze. But I think he was there or came back unexpectedly. I think he witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see. And covered it up for 22 years. The bitterness in Carmen's voice was palpable. Protected Frank Mitchell. Then his son. I don't know exactly what happened, Morgan said carefully. My father has implied that his role wasn't what it seems, that he tried to protect Rebecca. Protect her? Carmen's laugh was sharp, humorless. My daughter is gone. How did he protect her? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Morgan leaned forward, lowering her voice further. Mrs. Martinez, I believe my father is finally ready to tell the truth. He's dying. He has nothing left to lose, except his reputation, his legacy. Carmen's eyes narrowed. Men like Calvin Reynolds care about how they're remembered. He called you, didn't he, after all these years? That has to mean something. Carmen was silent for a long moment, considering. What does the cassette recording say? She finally asked. It's brief. Rebecca identifying herself, stating the date, beginning to explain the harassment. Then there's a struggle, and it cuts off, Dimas. She was interrupted, Carmen said softly, by whoever killed her. The bluntness of the statement hung between them. For 22 years, the official position had been that Rebecca ran away. Even as that theory became less credible with time, no one had publicly acknowledged the most likely alternative, that Rebecca Martinez had been murdered. I need to hear it. Carmen said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. The tape, I need to hear my daughter's voice. Of course, it's at the house. Not there. Carmen shook her head firmly. Not with Calvin present. Not with Sheriff Mitchell watching your every move. Then where? Carmen glanced toward the children's section where Logan and Abby were engaged in constructing what appeared to be a holiday craft project. I have a cabin outside town near Henderson Ridge. Meet me there tonight after dark. Bring everything you found. She scribbled an address on a slip of paper and pressed it into Morgan's hand. Come alone. Tell no one where you're going. I have my children with me, Morgan protested. I can't just leave them. Bring them if you must, but tell no one else. Carmen's grip on Morgan's wrist tightened. Not even your father, especially not your father. You still don't trust him. I haven't trusted anyone in this town for 22 years. Carmen released Morgan's wrist. 8 o'clock. Don't be late. With that, she stood and walked away, disappearing behind a row of bookshelves as silently as she'd appeared. Morgan sat still for a moment, processing the conversation. Carmen Martinez clearly believed Frank Mitchell had murdered her daughter and that Calvin Reynolds had helped cover it up. But what if the truth was more complicated? What if her father's role in the events of that night wasn't what it seemed? There was only one way to find out. She would meet Carmen tonight as requested. But first, she needed to have one more conversation with her father, whether Carmen approved or not. The Silver Dollar Diner sat in the heart of downtown Oakidge, its neon sign and chrome-detailed exterior a throwback to the 1950s. Inside, red vinyl booths lined the windows, a jukebox played classic country in the corner, and the scent of burgers and fries permeated the air. Morgan and the children slid into a booth, greeted by a waitress Morgan vaguely recognized as a few years behind her in school. The woman did a double take when she saw Morgan. "Morgan Reynolds, that really you?" Her name tag read Brenda. "In the flesh," Morgan confirmed with a smile. "These are my kids, Logan and Abby." "Well, aren't they just adorable?" Brenda's exaggerated cheerfulness felt forced. "What brings you back to Oakidge after all this time?" "Visiting my father for Christmas." "Calvin, yes. Heard about his situation." Brenda's expression shifted to rehearsed sympathy. "Such a shame. He's a real pillar of this community." "Yes, he is." "So what can I get you folks?" Brenda poised her pen over her order pad, clearly eager to change the subject. They ordered burgers, fries, and the milkshakes Logan had been anticipating since breakfast. As Brenda walked away, Morgan noticed several patrons stealing glances in their direction. Conversations hushed as they passed. "Why is everyone staring at us?" Logan asked, always observant. "Small towns," Morgan explained. "Everyone knows everyone and visitors are rare, especially prodigal daughters returning after years away." "What's a prodigal daughter?" Abby asked. "Someone who left home and came back." Morgan smiled, ruffling her daughter's hair. "It's from an old story." The bell above the diner door jingled, and the ambient conversation level dropped noticeably. Morgan looked up to see Sheriff Garrett Mitchell entering his uniform crisp, despite the late hour of the day, his badge catching the light as he scanned the room. His gaze locked with Morgan's, and a smile spread across his face, practiced political, not reaching his eyes. He approached their booth with measured steps. "Ms. Reynolds," he greeted her, "giving the kids the grand tour, I see." "Sheriff Mitchell." Morgan kept her voice neutral. "Yes, showing them all the highlights of my misspent youth." Mitchell chuckled, turning his attention to the children. "And you must be Logan and Abby. Your grandpa talks about you all the time." "You know our grandpa?" Logan asked. "Known him most of my life," Mitchell smiled. "He's a fine man. Oakidge won't be the same without him." The comment, with its implication that Calvin was already gone, sent a chill through Morgan. "We're trying not to think about that during the holidays," she said pointedly. Of course," Mitchell nodded sympathetically. "Well, I won't interrupt your family time any further. Just wanted to say hello." He turned to go, then paused as if struck by an afterthought. "Oh, I heard you were at the library earlier. Catch up with any old friends?" The question was casual, but Morgan caught the underlying meaning. Mitchell knew she'd spoken with Carmen. "Just showed the kids around," she replied. "It hasn't changed much." "Few things do in Oakidge." Mitchell's smile tightened. "That's what makes it special. Folks looking out for each other, keeping an eye on things. The way small towns should be." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Morgan maintained eye contact, refusing to be intimidated. "I've always found that small towns have the biggest secrets." Mitchell's smile vanished. "Enjoy your meal, Ms. Reynolds. Children." He nodded curtly and moved to the counter, where he engaged Brenda in conversation, though his gaze periodically drifted back to Morgan's booth. "He's creepy," Abby declared once Mitchell was out of earshot. Morgan couldn't help but smile at her daughter's astute observation. "Good instincts, kiddo." Brenda returned with their milkshakes, her cheerfulness distinctly dimmed. "Here you go. Burgers will be up shortly." "Thanks, Brenda," Morgan said. "You've been at the diner long." "About 15 years now." Brenda glanced nervously toward Mitchell at the counter. "Since high school." "So you would have been at a school with Rebecca Martinez," Morgan said casually. Brenda flinched visibly. I didn't really know her. She was quiet, kept to herself." "But you remember her?" "Everyone remembers her." Brenda's voice dropped to a whisper. "Listen, Morgan, you shouldn't be asking about Rebecca. Not here. Not now." "Why not?" Brenda's eyes darted toward Mitchell again. "Some stories are better left untold, for everyone's sake." With that cryptic warning so similar to her father's, Brenda hurried away to attend to other customers. Logan slurped his milkshake, oblivious to the undercurrents. "This is the best chocolate milkshake ever." "Told you," Morgan smiled, trying to shake the uneasiness that had settled over her. Mitchell was watching them, the diner patrons were whispering about them, and Brenda was clearly afraid to discuss Rebecca Martinez. The conspiracy of silence that had shrouded Rebecca's disappearance for 22 years was still very much in effect. But for how much longer? Because after lunch, Morgan drove the children around Oakidge, showing them her old neighborhood, the park where she'd played softball in summers, and the creek where local kids still went swimming during the brief Montana warm season. The tour was as much for her benefit as theirs, a reminder of the good memories from her childhood before everything had shattered in the wake of Rebecca's disappearance and her brother's death shortly after. As they were heading back toward Calvin's property, Morgan spotted a small figure standing beside the road ahead, a woman in a heavy coat, thumb extended in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. "Who's that?" Logan asked as Morgan slowed the car. "I'm not sure." Morgan peered through the windshield. As they drew closer, she recognized the petite frame and steel gray bob. "Carmen Martinez." Morgan pulled to the shoulder, rolling down her window. "Mrs. Martinez, do you need a ride?" Carmen leaned down to look into the car. "My truck broke down about a mile back. I was hoping someone would come along." "Hop in, we'll give you a lift." Carmen slid into the passenger seat, nodding to the children in the back. "Thank you. I was beginning to think I'd have to walk all the way back to town." "Were you heading home?" Morgan asked, pulling back onto the road. "No." Carmen's voice was tight. "I was on my way to see your father, actually." Morgan glanced sharply at her. "I thought you didn't trust him." "I don't, but I've waited 22 years for answers. After your visit this morning, I decided I couldn't wait until tonight." "We're heading there now," Morgan said. "You're welcome to join us." Carmen nodded, her expression unreadable. "Good, we'll get everything out in the open. Finally." The rest of the drive passed in tense silence. Morgan sensed that Carmen had more to say but was holding back in front of the children. For their part, Logan and Abby seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, remaining unusually quiet in the back seat. As they turned onto the long driveway leading to the Reynolds property, Morgan noticed a familiar Sheriff's Department SUV parked beside her father's truck. Mitchell had beaten them home. "He's here," Carmen said flatly. "Seems that way." Morgan parked beside the other vehicles. "Kids, why don't you go inside and find Grandpa? Tell him we have visitors." Once the children were out of earshot, Morgan turned to Carmen. "Whatever you're planning to say to my father, please remember my kids are in the house." "I have no intention of causing a scene," Carmen replied. "I just want the truth. After all these years, I deserve at least that much." They entered the house to find Calvin and Sheriff Mitchell seated in the living room, their conversation cutting off abruptly as the women appeared in the doorway. The sheriff rose to his feet, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holstered weapon. "Carmen," Mitchell's voice was cool, professional. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" Carmen's gaze moved past him to Calvin, who remained seated, his face ashen. "I think Mr. Reynolds has been expecting me for 22 years. Calvin's eyes met Morgan's, a silent question in them. She nodded slightly, letting him know she had initiated this confrontation. "Where are the children?" Calvin asked. "Upstairs," Logan answered, appearing at the top of the staircase. "Abby's showing me her new drawing." "Good," Calvin nodded. "Stay up there for a while, buddy. Grown-up talk down here." "Is everything okay, Grandpa?" "Everything's fine," Calvin assured him, though nothing about his tone or expression supported the claim. "Just some old business to discuss." Logan retreated reluctantly, and Calvin turned his attention back to the women standing in his living room. "I suppose this confrontation was inevitable," he said wearily, "though I'd hoped to have more time to prepare." "You've had 22 years, Carmen said, her voice sharp with suppressed emotion. "How much more time did you need, Mitchell?" Calvin looked to the sheriff. "I think it's time you left." "I don't think that's wise, Calvin." Mitchell remained standing, his posture rigid. "Not with the current volatile situation." "What my father means," Morgan interjected, "is that this is a private family matter. Your presence isn't required or desired. With all due respect, Ms. Reynolds, I am the sheriff of this county. If there are allegations of criminal activity—" "The only criminal activity," Carmen cut in, "is what you and your father did to my daughter, and the 22-year cover-up that followed." Mitchell's face hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Martinez. One without a shred of evidence to support it." "Actually," Morgan said, "that's where you're wrong. I found Rebecca's diary and a cassette recording she made the day she disappeared. Both implicate Frank Mitchell in her harassment and suggest he was with her at Copper Creek Station that night." The sheriff's expression remained impassive, but Morgan caught the flash of alarm in his eyes before he could mask it. I've heard enough of these unfounded accusations, he said coldly. Calvin, I strongly advise you to control the situation before it gets out of hand. The situation is already out of hand, Garrett, Calvin replied, his voice stronger than it had been in days. It has been since the night Rebecca disappeared. I can't carry this anymore. I won't. Dad, Morgan moved to his side, concerned by the pallor of his skin, the tremor in his hands. You don't have to do this now, not if you're not ready. I'm dying, Morgan, he spoke matter-of-factly. Every day the pain gets worse. The lucid moments get shorter. If I don't tell the truth now, I may never get another chance. And what truth is that, Calvin? Mitchell demanded. The ramblings of a sick old man, pain medication playing tricks with your memory. My memory is just fine, Calvin snapped, especially about that night. I remember every detail, every word spoken, every promise made and broken. He turned to Carmen, who stood rigid by the door, her face a mask of controlled emotion. I owe you the truth, Carmen. I've owed it to you for 22 years, and I'm ready to pay that debt whatever the cost. Mitchell moved suddenly, stepping between Calvin and Carmen. This has gone far enough. Calvin, you're not thinking clearly. The medication. Get out of my house, Garrett. Calvin's voice was steel. Now, or I'll have Morgan call the state police and tell them everything. You're making a mistake, Mitchell warned. One you can't take back. The mistake was made 22 years ago, Calvin replied, when I chose my family's safety over the truth. When I helped bury that poor girl's body and let her mother spend decades wondering what happened to her. Carmen made a small, broken sound, half gasp, half sob. Dad, Morgan whispered, stunned by the admission. What are you saying? I'm saying I know what happened to Rebecca Martinez. Calvin's eyes never left Mitchell's face. I know who killed her and why, and I know where she's buried. This is slander, Mitchell hissed. Dangerous, unfounded slander that could destroy this town. No, Calvin shook his head slowly. It's confession, and it's long overdue. A tense silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the turn and the faint sounds of the children playing upstairs. Mitchell's hand still rested on his weapon, his knuckles white with tension. Carmen stood frozen by the door, tears streaming silently down her face. Morgan remained at her father's side, her mind racing to process the implications of his words. Finally, Mitchell spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. If you do this, Calvin, there's no going back. For any of us. I know. Calvin met his gaze steadily. That's a price I'm willing to pay. The question is, are you... Before Mitchell could respond, the sound of a vehicle approaching drew everyone's attention. Through the front window, Morgan saw a state police cruiser pulling into the driveway, followed by another. What did you do? Mitchell demanded, his composure cracking for the first time. Insurance, Calvin replied calmly. I called them this morning after you left the station last night. Told them I had information about a 22-year-old cold case. Asked them to send someone from the major crime unit. The look of betrayal on Mitchell's face would have been comical under different circumstances. You son of a bitch. Maybe so, Calvin agreed. But at least I'll die with a clear conscience. Can you say the same, Garrett? The front door opened without a knock, and two state troopers entered, their expressions professionally neutral. Sheriff Mitchell, the older of the two, nodded a greeting. Mr. Reynolds, I'm Detective Randall with the Montana State Police Major Crime Unit. This is my partner, Detective Chen. We understand you have information regarding the disappearance of Rebecca Martinez in 2000. Mitchell recovered quickly, his face smoothing into its practiced, authoritative mask. There's been a misunderstanding, Detective. Mr. Reynolds is suffering from terminal cancer. The medications are affecting his mental state. My mental state is fine, Calvin interrupted, and I'm prepared to give a full statement about what happened to Rebecca Martinez on March 20th, 2000, including my role in covering up her murder and the location of her remains. The detectives exchanged glances. That's a serious claim, Mr. Reynolds, Randall said. Perhaps we should continue this conversation at our field office. No, Calvin shook his head. I may not have the strength to do this twice. I need to say it here now with everyone present. He gestured to the couch. Please sit. This will take some time. Mitchell remained standing, his face a mask of controlled fury. I don't have to stay for this farce. Actually, Sheriff, Detective Chen spoke for the first time. Given the nature of the allegations, we'd prefer if you remain present, unless you'd rather we continue this discussion at our headquarters. The implied threat was clear. Mitchell sat reluctantly, positioning himself as far from Calvin as possible. Carmen moved to the armchair across from Calvin, her eyes never leaving his face. "Tell me what happened to my daughter," she said quietly. "All of it." Calvin nodded, taking a deep breath. "It started earlier than any of us realized." Frank Mitchell had been watching Rebecca for months before she disappeared. What followed was a confession 22 years in the making. Calvin spoke steadily, his voice growing stronger as he unburned himself of the secrets he'd carried for so long. The detectives recorded his statement, interrupting occasionally to clarify details, while Carmen listened in silent grief, tears streaming unchecked down her face. According to Calvin, Frank Mitchell, then sheriff of Oakidge County, had developed an unhealthy obsession with Rebecca Martinez during her junior year of high school. At first, it manifested in innocent-seeming encounters, offering her rides home from the library, appearing at school events, where she was present, finding reasons to visit the Martinez home on official business. But over time, the behavior escalated to stalking, leaving notes in her locker and making anonymous phone calls. Rebecca had eventually confided in her mother about the harassment, but without concrete evidence linking it to the sheriff, there was little Carmen could do. She'd encouraged Rebecca to document everything, which explained the diary Morgan had found. The night Rebecca disappeared, Calvin continued, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the living room. She came to the station at around 11, just as she'd written in her diary. But she wasn't meeting Frank, she was hiding from him. She'd finally realized he was her stalker and was planning to go to the state police the next day. "How do you know this?" Morgan asked. "Because she told me," Calvin replied. "I was still there doing the monthly inventory." She was terrified, said Frank had figured out she knew and was coming after her. "She asked me to help her hide until morning, when she could get a bus to Helena." He paused, the weight of memory momentarily overwhelming him. "I agreed. I told her to wait in my office while I finished closing up. I was going to take her to the hunting cabin my father owned out past Henderson Ridge. No one knew about it except family. But Frank arrived before you could leave." Carmen guessed, her voice hollow. Calvin nodded. "He came in through the back, must have seen the lights still on. He was different than I'd ever seen him. Manic, dangerous. Said he knew Rebecca had been telling lies about him, that she was trying to ruin his reputation, his career." "Where was Rebecca during this?" Detective Randall asked. "In my office. She heard his voice and started recording on a small cassette player she had in her backpack. I tried to convince Frank to leave, told him no one was there but me. But then Rebecca's phone rang." "Her phone," Morgan interrupted. "In her diary, she mentioned phone calls, but not having a cell phone." "It was new," Carmen explained. "I just gotten it for her the week before for emergencies." Calvin nodded. "The ring gave her away. Frank pushed past me to the office. I heard Rebecca scream, then a crash. By the time I got there," his voice broke, "he'd hit her with a paperweight from my desk. She was on the floor, blood everywhere, not moving. The room was silent except for Carmen's quiet weeping. I checked for a pulse," Calvin continued after a moment. "There wasn't one. Frank was in shock, kept saying she'd attacked him, that it was self-defense. Then he switched, became calculating. Said no one would believe it was an accident, that we needed to dispose of the body. Detective Chen's voice was sharp. He threatened my family." Calvin's gaze moved to Morgan. Said if I didn't help him, he'd make sure Morgan was implicated. She'd been at the station earlier that day, her fingerprints would be all over the place. He'd plant evidence, make it look like she and Rebecca had argued over some boy. "So you helped him hide my daughter's body?" Carmen's voice was flat, empty of emotion. "Yes." The admission seemed to physically pain Calvin. "We wrapped her in a tarp and put her in Frank's red pickup. He kept it at the hunting cabin, used it for off-road driving. Not his official vehicle. We buried her near Henderson Ridge by an old lightning-struck pine tree. I can show you the exact location." "And the cassette recorder?" Morgan asked. "Rebecca's backpack. I found the recorder on the floor after we buried her. The tape was still running. I hid it in the strongbox under the office floor, along with her diary, which had fallen from her backpack. I couldn't bring myself to destroy them. Thought maybe someday." "Someday what?" Carmen demanded. "Someday you'd find the courage you lacked that night." Calvin met her gaze, his eyes filled with regret. "Yes, exactly that." Throughout the confession, Sheriff Mitchell had remained silent, his expression transitioning from fury to calculation to resignation. Now he leaned forward, addressing the detectives. This is all very dramatic, he said, his voice controlled. But you should know that Calvin Reynolds has a history of mental health issues. His terminal diagnosis has clearly— Give it up, Garrett, Calvin cut him off. It's over. The truth is out. My father is dead, Mitchell snapped. He can't defend himself against these outrageous accusations. But the evidence can speak for him, Morgan interjected. The diary, the cassette, the location of Rebecca's remains. And I suspect when the state police search that lightning-struck pine, they'll find DNA evidence that will confirm everything my father has said. Mitchell fell silent, the reality of his situation apparently sinking in. What was your involvement, Sheriff? Detective Randall asked. Were you aware of your father's actions? I knew nothing about any of this, Mitchell insisted. If what Calvin says is true, and that's a big if, this is the first I'm hearing of it. That's a lie, Calvin said flatly. Garrett found out what happened within days. Frank was falling apart, drinking heavily, talking about confessing. Garrett helped stabilize the situation, convinced his father to stick to the Rebecca ran away story. And after Frank died in 2008, Garrett continued the cover-up. You can't prove any of that. Mitchell's voice was ice. Maybe not, Calvin conceded, but I can prove what happened that night. And once the truth about Rebecca comes out, people will start asking questions about other missing girls. The room went still. Other girls, Detective Chen leaned forward. What other girls? Calvin's gaze remained fixed on Mitchell. Frank Mitchell wasn't just obsessed with Rebecca. There were others before her, girls who supposedly ran away or who went missing while passing through Oakidge. Frank handled those cases personally, made sure they were never solved. That's enough, Mitchell stood abruptly. I won't listen to these slanders against my father's memory. Three girls, Calvin continued inexorably, between 1995 and 1998. All Hispanic, all between 16 and 18, all declared runaways, despite evidence to the contrary. I have their names, the case numbers, and the locations where I believe they're buried. Mitchell lunged forward suddenly, his hand moving to his weapon. But before he could draw, Detective Randall was on his feet, his own weapon aimed at Mitchell's chest. Don't, Randall warned. Sheriff Mitchell, I'm going to need you to step back and keep your hands where I can see them. For a moment, it seemed Mitchell might disregard the order. Then slowly he raised his hands. You're making a mistake, he said, but the fight had gone out of his voice. All of you. Sheriff Garrett Mitchell. Detective Chen stood producing a pair of handcuffs. You're being detained pending investigation into the disappearance and suspected murder of Rebecca Martinez and potentially other victims. You have the right to remain silent. As the detective continued reciting the Miranda warning, Morgan moved to her father's side. He looked exhausted, but somehow lighter, as if the confession had physically lifted a burden from his shoulders. You did it, she said softly. You told the truth. Too late, he replied, watching as the detectives led Mitchell from the house. 22 years too late. No. The voice came from Carmen, who stood now wiping tears from her face. Not too late for justice, not too late for my daughter to finally come home. She approached Calvin, stopping directly in front of his chair. For a long moment, she stared down at him, her expression unreadable. Then, to Morgan's surprise, she reached out and took his hand. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not for what you did then, but for what you've done today. Calvin's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve your gratitude or your forgiveness. No, Carmen agreed. You don't, but Rebecca deserves to rest in peace, and now perhaps she can. The sound of footsteps on the stairs reminded Morgan that her children had been upstairs throughout the entire confession. Logan stood on the landing, his young face solemn. Mom, he called uncertainly, is everything okay? We heard shouting. Morgan moved to the stairs, gathering her son in her arms. Everything's going to be okay, she promised, hoping it was true. Where's your sister? Still drawing. She had her headphones on. Logan looked past her to where the state troopers were leading Sheriff Mitchell to their cruiser in handcuffs. Is Grandpa in trouble? No, honey. Grandpa just helped solve a very old mystery. He did something brave today. Logan nodded, still watching the scene outside. Like in your podcast, The Cold Cases? Yes, Morgan smiled sadly. Just like that. She held her son close, watching as the state police vehicles pulled away, taking with them the man who had helped perpetuate a 22-year cover-up. In the living room, Calvin and Carmen sat across from each other, two people bound by tragedy finally facing the truth together. The storm Morgan had sensed approaching had broken at last, but instead of destruction, it had brought something unexpected, a chance for healing, for justice, for closure. And perhaps most importantly, a chance for Rebecca Martinez to finally come home. The search for Rebecca's remains began at dawn the next day. Based on Calvin's directions, the state police assembled a search team that included forensic specialists, cadaver dogs, and ground-penetrating radar operators. Calvin insisted on being present despite his weakened condition, determined to personally lead them to the site where he and Frank Mitchell had buried Rebecca 22 years earlier. Morgan arranged for a neighbor to watch Logan and Abby, then drove her father to the meeting point at the base of Henderson Ridge. Carmen Martinez was already there, standing slightly apart from the cluster of law enforcement vehicles, her small frame rigid with determination. "You don't have to do this," Morgan told her father as she helped him from the car. "You've given them detailed directions. Let the professionals handle it from here." Calvin shook his head, leaning heavily on his cane. "I need to see it through. I owe Carmen that much." The site was approximately 2 miles from the nearest access road, necessitating the use of all-terrain vehicles to transport the search team and equipment. A state trooper helped Calvin into one of the vehicles, his movements gentle, respectful, despite the nature of Calvin's involvement in the case. "Mrs. Martinez will be riding with you," the trooper informed them as Carmen approached. "If that's acceptable to both of you." Calvin nodded, his expression guarded, as Carmen climbed into the vehicle beside him. Morgan took the seat behind them, close enough to intervene if the conversation became too heated, but giving them space to talk if they chose to. They did not. The journey passed in silence, the only sounds the rumble of the ATV's engine and the crunch of snow beneath its tires. The mountains loomed around them, indifferent to the human drama playing out in their shadow, just as they had been indifferent to Rebecca's fate 22 years earlier. After about 30 minutes, Calvin raised a hand signaling the driver to stop. "There," he said, pointing to a massive pine tree standing alone in a small clearing. "That's the lightning tree." Even after 22 years, the tree was unmistakable. Its trunk split halfway up by some long-ago lightning strike, its dual crowns reaching toward the sky like supplicating hands. The clearing around it was pristine, untouched by human activity for decades, it seemed. The search team assembled around the tree, waiting for further direction. Calvin struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane as he surveyed the area. "Southeast of the tree," he said finally, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "About 20 feet. We dug as deep as we could, but the ground was partially frozen. 3, maybe 4 feet down." The search coordinator nodded, directing the cadaver dogs to begin working the area Calvin had indicated. The forensic team prepared their equipment, and the rest of the team established a perimeter around the search zone. Morgan helped her father to a folding chair someone had thoughtfully provided, then stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. Carmen remained standing a few yards away, her eyes fixed on the search area, her expression a mixture of dread and desperate hope. The dogs alerted almost immediately, converging on a spot exactly where Calvin had indicated. The search coordinator raised his hand, calling the dogs back and signaling for the forensic team to move in. What followed was a painstaking excavation of the site. The ground-penetrating radar confirmed an anomaly approximately 3 feet below the surface, and the team began the delicate process of removing layers of soil, documenting everything as they went. 2 hours into the excavation, a technician's careful brushing revealed a fragment of blue fabric. Carmen made a small broken sound, recognition perhaps of something her daughter had worn that final day. The work continued with increased care, gradually revealing more of the tarp Calvin had described. By mid-afternoon, they had exposed enough to confirm that human remains lay within. "We found her," the search coordinator announced, quietly approaching Calvin, Morgan, and Carmen. "Based on the initial examination, the remains appear consistent with a female adolescent, approximately 17 years of age, as described in your statement, Mr. Reynolds." Carmen closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. After 22 years of uncertainty, of desperate hope, alternating with crushing despair, she finally knew for certain what had happened to her daughter. "The medical examiner will need to make a formal identification," the coordinator continued gently. "But given the location and the circumstances described in your statement, we're reasonably confident these are Rebecca Martinez's remains." Calvin nodded, his own eyes wet with tears. "Thank you," he said simply. The recovery of Rebecca's remains continued into the evening, the site illuminated by portable floodlights as the forensic team worked with meticulous care to preserve every piece of evidence. Calvin insisted on staying until the process was complete, despite Morgan's concerns about his health. "I was here when she was buried," he told Morgan quietly. "I need to be here when she's found." As darkness fell over Henderson Ridge, the team finally lifted a body bag containing Rebecca's remains onto a stretcher for transport back to the vehicles. Carmen approached, placing a hand briefly on the bag before stepping back to allow the technicians to secure it for the journey down the mountain. The mood during the return trip was solemn, but somehow lighter, as if the discovery of Rebecca's remains had released a tension that had held Oakidge in its grip for 22 years. Even Calvin seemed more at peace despite the physical toll the day had taken on him. Back at the staging area, the medical examiner took custody of Rebecca's remains for transport to the state facility in Helena. Carmen would follow the next day for the formal identification process, though no one doubted what the examination would confirm. As Morgan helped her father back into their car, Carmen approached them one last time. "Thank you," she said to Calvin, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "for giving me back my daughter." Calvin shook his head slowly. "I don't deserve your thanks, Carmen. Not after what I did, what I failed to do." "You failed her then," Carmen acknowledged, "but you've done right by her today. That counts for something." She turned to Morgan. "Your father isn't the only one who needs to make amends. This town buried my daughter twice, once in the ground and once in silence. The conspiracy of silence was almost as cruel as the murder itself." "It ends now," Morgan promised. "All of it." Carmen nodded, then walked to her own vehicle, her back straight despite the emotional weight she carried. As Morgan drove her father home, she found herself thinking about the layers of secrets that had been buried in Oakidge for decades. Rebecca's body was only the most literal of them. There were others still to be unearthed, the full extent of Frank Mitchell's crimes, the network of complicity that had protected him, the other victims Calvin had alluded to. The excavation had only just begun. News of Rebecca Martinez's discovery and Sheriff Mitchell's arrest spread through Oakidge like wildfire. By the following morning, news vans from stations across Montana had descended on the small town, parking along Main Street and setting up cameras outside the sheriff's department, the courthouse, and even Calvin's property. Morgan kept the children inside, away from the intrusive lenses, and shouted questions. Calvin retreated to his bedroom, exhausted by the previous day's events and in need of increased pain medication. The state police had established a command post at the sheriff's department, effectively taking control of law enforcement in Oakidge while the investigation continued. Mitchell remained in custody and Helena denied bail due to the severity of the charges and his potential flight risk. Around noon, Morgan's phone rang, an unknown number with a Helena area code. "Morgan Reynolds," she answered. "Ms. Reynolds, this is Detective Randall. I wanted to update you on the investigation. The medical examiner has made a preliminary identification of the remains as Rebecca Martinez based on dental records. They've also confirmed blunt force trauma to the skull as the likely cause of death, consistent with your father's statement." "Thank you for letting me know," Morgan said. "How is Mrs. Martinez?" "Holding up remarkably well under the circumstances. She's making arrangements to have Rebecca's remains cremated once the examination is complete." Randall paused. "There's something else. Based on information your father provided, we've opened investigations into 3 other missing persons cases from the 1990s. Preliminary searches have identified potential burial sites for 2 of the victims." Morgan closed her eyes, the full weight of Frank Mitchell's crimes washing over her. "So my father was right. There were others." "It appears so. Sheriff Mitchell is maintaining his innocence regarding any knowledge of his father's actions, but we've obtained a search warrant for both his home and office. The investigation is ongoing." After ending the call, Morgan sat quietly at the kitchen table, processing everything. The story was bigger than she had imagined. A serial predator protected by his position of authority, multiple victims forgotten by a system designed to protect them, a decades-long conspiracy of silence that had allowed the perpetrator to die peacefully while families suffered in ignorance. This was no longer just about Rebecca Martinez. It was about exposing a systemic failure that had allowed vulnerable young women to disappear without consequence. Morgan's podcast producer had been calling incessantly since the news broke, eager for her to record an episode about the case. But this wasn't just another story for her to tell. This was personal, complicated by her father's role in the cover-up and her own connection to the town. A soft knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, Morgan could see it wasn't another reporter, but Jack Coleman, editor of the Oakidge Gazette, and one of the few local journalists who had continued to ask questions about Rebecca's disappearance over the years. She opened the door cautiously. "Jack." "Morgan." He nodded, his expression serious. "I'm not here as press, not officially anyway. May I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside to admit him. Jack was in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime listening to other people's stories. He'd been a cub reporter at the Gazette when Rebecca disappeared, one of the few who had questioned the runaway narrative. "How's your father?" Jack asked as he settled at the kitchen table. "Resting. Yesterday took a lot out of him." Jack nodded. "I can imagine what he did, coming forward after all these years. That took courage." "Courage would have been telling the truth 22 years ago." Morgan replied more sharply than she'd intended. "Maybe so." Jack didn't argue the point. "But better late than never in this case. Thanks to Calvin, Rebecca's coming home. And so are others, from what I hear." Morgan studied him. "You always suspected, didn't you, about Frank Mitchell?" "I had questions, inconsistencies in the official reports, witnesses whose statements changed after speaking with the sheriff, evidence that went missing." Jack sighed. "But suspicion isn't proof, and the Mitchells had this town locked down tight. Anyone who pushed too hard found themselves facing consequences: tax audits, traffic stops, business permits, mysteriously delayed or denied." "And now?" Morgan asked. "Now that the truth is coming out. Now people are talking. 22 years of silence is breaking open all at once." Jack leaned forward. "That's actually why I'm here. I've been collecting information on Frank Mitchell for years, interviews with people who had concerns, but were afraid to come forward, discrepancies in official reports, patterns in the cases he handled personally. I want to share it with you." Morgan was taken aback. "With me, why?" "Because you have a platform I don't. Your podcast reaches millions. The Gazette is lucky to hit 1,000 readers on a good week." Jack's expression was earnest. "This story deserves to be told properly by someone who understands Oakidge but isn't beholden to it. Someone who can be objective despite her personal connection." "I'm hardly objective, Jack. My father was involved in the cover-up, which gives you insight no outside reporter could have. You understand the complex dynamics at play, how a good man like Calvin could be coerced into making terrible choices, how an entire town could conspire in silence out of fear or misplaced loyalty." Morgan considered his words. He wasn't wrong. She had a unique perspective on the case, one that could provide context and nuance to a story that might otherwise be sensationalized by outside media. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked finally. "A collaboration. My research, your platform. A comprehensive examination of not just Rebecca's case, but the system that failed her and others like her. The culture of silence that protected a predator for decades." The proposition was tempting. This was the kind of story Morgan had built her career on: exposing injustice, giving voice to the voiceless, holding power accountable. "I need to think about it," she said. "This isn't just another case for me. It's my family, my hometown." "I understand." Jack rose to leave. "Take your time, but not too much. The news cycle moves fast, and there are already national outlets descending on Oakidge. If we want to control the narrative, ensure the story is told with the complexity and care it deserves, we need to act soon." After Jack left, Morgan checked on her father. Calvin was asleep. His breathing labored but steady, his face relaxed in a way it hadn't been in days. The burden of his secret had aged him prematurely. Now that it was lifted, he seemed somehow younger despite his illness. Watching him sleep, Morgan felt her anger giving way to a more complex emotion, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Her father had made a terrible choice 22 years ago, one that had caused immeasurable pain to Carmen Martinez and others. But he had also been a victim of Frank Mitchell's manipulation, threatened and coerced into complicity. In the end, he had found the courage to tell the truth, to face the consequences of his actions, to bring Rebecca home. It didn't erase what he had done, but it was a step toward redemption. And perhaps that was the story Morgan needed to tell, not just of crime and punishment, but of moral complexity, of the courage it takes to face one's worst mistakes, of the possibility of redemption, even after decades of silence. She sat beside her father's bed, taking his hand in hers. His eyes fluttered open, recognition dawning slowly through the haze of pain medication. "Morgan," he whispered, his voice thin but clear. "You found it, the box." "Yes, Dad. I found Rebecca's diary, the cassette tape, everything." Calvin closed his eyes briefly as if gathering strength. "Then you know what I did, what I failed to do." "I know you were there the night she disappeared," Morgan said carefully. "I know you helped cover it up afterward. What I don't understand is when." Her father's grip tightened on her hand, surprising in its strength. "It wasn't what you think," he said. "I didn't hurt that girl. I tried to help her." "Then tell me what happened, all of it." But before Calvin could respond, footsteps on the stairs announced the children's return. The conversation would have to wait. Again. Morgan pressed a gentle kiss to her father's forehead. "Rest now. We'll talk later." As she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. For her father, for the truth, for justice, long delayed. One way or another, the buried secrets of Oakidge were about to see the light of day. 3 days after Rebecca Martinez's remains were discovered, Calvin Reynolds died peacefully in his sleep. Morgan found him in the morning, his face serene, a photograph of his late wife clutched in his hand. The cancer had finally claimed him, but not before he'd unburdened his soul and set right a 22-year-old wrong. The timing seemed deliberate, as if he'd been holding on just long enough to complete the task he'd set for himself. The day before, he'd given a formal videotaped statement to the state police, detailing everything he knew about Frank Mitchell's crimes and the subsequent cover-up. He'd also spoken privately with Carmen Martinez for over an hour, a conversation whose contents neither of them shared, but which left both visibly changed. Morgan had been prepared for her father's death for months, but the reality still struck her with unexpected force. She'd spent the past few days caught between anger at his decades of silence and pride in his final act of courage. Now all that remained was grief. Complicated, messy grief for a flawed man who had in the end chosen truth over self-preservation. The town of Oakidge found itself similarly conflicted. Calvin Reynolds had been a respected community member, a Vietnam veteran, a small business owner who'd employed local teens and supported town initiatives. But he'd also been complicit in concealing a young girl's murder, in denying her mother closure for more than 2 decades. The news vans that had descended on the town in the wake of Rebecca's discovery doubled after Calvin's death, their satellite dishes blooming like strange metal flowers in the winter landscape. Reporters clustered outside the Reynolds property, shouting questions whenever Morgan or the children appeared. She kept the curtains drawn, the doors locked, protecting Logan and Abby from the media frenzy while trying to help them process their grandfather's death. Jack Coleman proved an unexpected ally during those dark days. He ran interference with the press, handled the funeral arrangements, and brought groceries when Morgan couldn't face the gauntlet of cameras. Most importantly, he kept her informed about developments in the investigation, sharing information before it became public. "They've identified a second victim," he told her over coffee in her kitchen 5 days after Calvin's death. Maria Sanchez, 17, reported missing in 1990 while passing through Oakidge on her way to Seattle. Frank Mitchell handled the case personally, ruled her a runaway, despite her abandoned vehicle being found at a local motel. Morgan nodded, processing the information. "The pattern my father described." "Exactly. Young Hispanic women, no local connections, easily dismissed as runaways." Jack's expression was grim. "State police found her remains exactly where Calvin said they would, near an abandoned mining cabin in the North Country. Same MO as Rebecca, blunt force trauma to the skull." "And Mitchell?" Morgan asked. "Garrett, I mean. Still in custody, still maintaining his innocence regarding any knowledge of his father's crimes. But they've found evidence suggesting otherwise, financial records showing he paid for the construction of a cabin directly over one of the suspected burial sites in 2010, 2 years after his father died." "Deliberate concealment," Morgan murmured. "Looks that way." Jack hesitated. "There's something else. The state police executed a search warrant on Frank Mitchell's hunting cabin yesterday. They found a hidden room beneath the floorboards. Inside were trophies, items belonging to the victims, jewelry, identification cards, personal effects." Morgan closed her eyes, imagining the horror of that discovery. "How many?" "They're still cataloging everything, but preliminary estimates suggest at least 6 victims, possibly more. The time span appears to extend back to the early 90s. 6 young women at minimum. 6 lives cut short by a predator hiding behind a badge. 6 families denied closure for decades. Have you thought more about my proposal? Jack asked, his voice gentle. About telling this story properly. Morgan had been considering it since their first conversation. Her podcast producer was still calling daily, eager for her to record an episode about the case. National news outlets had offered substantial sums for exclusive interviews, but none of them could tell the story with the context and nuance it deserved. Yes, she said finally, I'll do it, but not as a regular podcast episode. This needs to be a special series, multiple episodes exploring all aspects of the case. The victims, the investigation, the cover-up, the town's complicity, everything. Jack nodded, relief evident in his expression. I was hoping you'd say that. I've already started organizing my research files. When do you want to begin? Morgan glanced toward the window where snow was beginning to fall again, adding another layer to the blanket that covered Oakidge. After the funerals, she said quietly, both of them. Calvin Reynolds was laid to rest on a clear, cold Saturday morning, the mountain air crystalline and sharp in the lungs. Despite the controversy surrounding his final confession, the church was filled to capacity. Friends, neighbors, former employees, and Vietnam veterans who'd served with him. The pews held a community divided in its feelings, but united in respect for a man who had eventually chosen truth. Logan and Abby sat beside Morgan in the front row, solemn in their dark clothes, struggling to understand the complexity of their grandfather's legacy. Logan had asked difficult questions in the days following Calvin's death, about right and wrong, about courage and cowardice, about why good people sometimes make terrible choices. Morgan had answered as honestly as she could, grateful for her son's innate sense of moral nuance. He did a bad thing, Logan had concluded after one such conversation. But he wasn't a bad person. Is that right, Mom? I think that's exactly right, Morgan had replied, marveling at her 12-year-old's wisdom. Now as the minister spoke of forgiveness and redemption, Morgan found herself scanning the crowded church. Many faces were familiar from her childhood, aged but recognizable. Others were strangers, perhaps newer residents, or reporters attempting to blend in with the mourners. One face stood out among the rest. Carmen Martinez sat in the back row, her expression somber but composed. Their eyes met briefly across the church, and Carmen offered a small nod, an acknowledgement, not quite forgiveness, but something close to understanding. After the service, as mourners filed past to offer condolences, Jack Coleman drew Morgan aside. The state police are planning to hold a press conference tomorrow, he murmured. They found something significant at the Mitchell property. I don't have details yet, but it sounds like it might break the case wide open. More victims? Morgan asked, keeping her voice low. No, evidence of Garrett's involvement. Direct evidence that he knew about his father's crimes long before 2008 and actively participated in the cover-up. Before Morgan could respond, Detective Chen approached, extending her hand. Ms. Reynolds, my condolences for your loss. Her handshake was firm, professional. I wonder if I might have a word with you in private. Morgan nodded, excusing herself from Jack and leading Detective Chen to a quiet corner of the church vestibule. We've been examining the evidence collected from both Mitchell properties. Chen began without preamble. Among the items recovered was a series of photographs taken between 1998 and 2007. They show Garrett Mitchell at various crime scenes, including the area where Rebecca Martinez was buried. Morgan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. He was there when she was buried. The timestamps on the photos suggest he arrived shortly after. They show him examining the gravesite, then meeting with Frank Mitchell and your father at the hunting cabin. Chen's expression remained neutral, but her eyes were kind. I wanted you to hear this from me, not in tomorrow's press conference. Your father may have been more deeply involved than he admitted. The revelation shouldn't have surprised Morgan. Calvin had acknowledged helping bury Rebecca's body, but the existence of photographic evidence made it suddenly painfully real. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because the full case file will be released to the media tomorrow. I thought you deserved to be prepared. Chen hesitated. Also because we found something else. A written confession from your father dated March 2001 describing everything that happened the night Rebecca disappeared. It was in a sealed envelope in Frank Mitchell's safe, along with what appears to be blackmail material on several prominent Oakidge citizens. Blackmail. Morgan's journalistic instincts kicked in despite her grief. What kind of blackmail? Evidence of various indiscretions, affairs, tax fraud, business irregularities. Nothing criminal on the scale of what Frank did, but enough to ensure silence from people who might otherwise have asked questions. The pieces clicked into place in Morgan's mind. That's how he controlled the town, how he kept everyone quiet about Rebecca and the others. Chen nodded. It appears so. And your father's confession was his insurance policy against Calvin ever coming forward. Morgan absorbed this new information, reconciling it with what she already knew. Her father had been both victim and accomplice, coerced into silence, but ultimately complicit in maintaining it. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. I appreciate your discretion. As Chen moved away, Morgan found herself standing alone in the church vestibule, the weight of her father's complicated legacy settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The truth was never simple, never clean. Calvin had been caught in a web partly of his own making, trapped by his initial poor choice and the powerful man who exploited it. The story Morgan needed to tell was growing more complex by the day, not just a tale of murder and cover-up, but an exploration of power coercion and the moral compromises people make under pressure, of how a single bad decision can ripple outward for decades, touching countless lives. And at the center of it all, a 17-year-old girl who had simply wanted to graduate high school and go to college, who had encountered evil wearing a badge and paid the ultimate price. Rebecca Martinez deserved justice, and Morgan was determined to ensure she received it, no matter how painful the process might be for Oakidge or for herself. Rebecca's funeral was held 3 days later after the state medical examiner released her remains to Carmen. Unlike Calvin's well-attended service, this was a small private affair. Just Carmen, a few close friends who had remained loyal through the decades, and Morgan with her children. The press conference Detective Chen had mentioned had indeed broken the case wide open. Garrett Mitchell now faced multiple charges, including accessory after the fact to murder, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. The red truck Rebecca had mentioned in her final diary entry had been found hidden in a storage facility registered under a false name, but paid for with Mitchell's credit card, preserved investigators believed as a macabre trophy. More disturbing still was the revelation that Frank Mitchell's crimes extended beyond the 6 victims initially identified. Investigators now believed he might be responsible for as many as 12 murders, spanning nearly 2 decades, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in Montana history, all while serving as the county's chief law enforcement officer. The story had exploded across national media, with Oakidge suddenly thrust into an unwelcome spotlight. Documentarians and true crime producers descended on the town, booking every available hotel room and rental property, their cameras capturing the community's discomfort and disbelief. After Rebecca's service, Carmen invited Morgan and the children back to her cabin for coffee. The modest structure stood on a hillside overlooking Henderson Ridge, its picture windows framing the mountains in the distance. I bought this place when I moved back last year, Carmen explained as she served coffee to Morgan and hot chocolate to the children. Needed somewhere I could see the mountains but not be right in town. Too many memories there. It's beautiful, Morgan said sincerely. The cabin was small but meticulously maintained, with colorful woven rugs and handcrafted furniture that spoke to Carmen's Mexican heritage. Your father never sold the gas station, Carmen observed, sitting across from Morgan at the kitchen table. The children had moved to the living room where Logan was helping Abby with a jigsaw puzzle. Why do you think that was? Morgan considered the question. I'm not sure, guilt maybe, or perhaps he couldn't bring himself to profit from a place where something so terrible had happened. Carmen nodded thoughtfully. I used to drive by it sometimes before I left town, wondering if Rebecca's spirit was there, if she was trying to tell me something. She smiled sadly. Foolish thoughts of a grieving mother. Not foolish, Morgan said gently. Natural. Perhaps, Carmen sipped her coffee. What will happen to it now, the station, I mean? I inherited it along with the house and property. I haven't decided what to do with any of it yet. Morgan had been avoiding thinking about the practical aspects of her father's estate, focusing instead on helping her children process their grief. I have a suggestion if you're willing to hear it. Carmen set down her cup, her expression earnest. Turn it into something positive. A memorial, perhaps, not just for Rebecca, but for all the victims. A place where their stories can be told. The idea resonated with Morgan immediately. Copper Creek Station had been a site of tragedy and deception for too long. Transforming it into a place of remembrance and truth seemed like a fitting way to honor both Rebecca and Calvin's final act of courage. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said, "and I'd like your input on how it should be done. This should be about the victim, not about assuaging your guilt over your father's actions." Carmen finished for her, not unkindly. Morgan nodded, feeling transparent under the older woman's gaze. "We all carry guilt, Morgan. Some deserve, some not." Carmen reached across the table, taking Morgan's hand in a gesture that surprised them both. "Your father made terrible choices, but in the end he found the courage to tell the truth. That counts for something." "That's almost exactly what you said to him at the house," Morgan recalled. "Because it's true, the past can't be changed. But we can choose how we move forward from it." Carmen squeezed Morgan's hand before releasing it. "Speaking of which, Jack Coleman tells me you are planning a podcast series about what happened." "Yes." Morgan wondered if Carmen would object if the idea of having her daughter's story broadcast to millions seemed exploitative. "I want to ensure the story is told properly, with respect for the victims and an honest examination of how such crimes could go undetected for so long." To her surprise, Carmen nodded approval. "Good. The truth should be told no matter how painful. Too many people kept silent for too many years, including me." "You?" Morgan was confused. "You never stopped searching for Rebecca, never stopped asking questions." "But I stopped asking them loudly. After a few years, when it became clear no one was listening, I retreated into private grief. I moved away, started a new life." Carmen's expression hardened. "I should have been on the courthouse steps every day demanding answers. I should have gone to the state police, the FBI, anyone who would listen." "You did what you could," Morgan said gently. "The system was stacked against you." "Perhaps, but I've thought often about other mothers over the years. Women who lost daughters to Frank Mitchell and never knew why. At least now they'll have answers." Carmen stood moving to the window that overlooked the mountains. "That's why your podcast matters. Why the memorial matters. The truth is painful, but silence is deadly." Morgan joined her at the window, watching as snow began to fall. Again, soft flakes drifting against the darkening sky. Below them, the lights of Oakidge twinkled in the valley, a town facing its darkest secrets after decades of determined ignorance. "I'd like to stay," Morgan said, suddenly surprising herself with the decision. "Not permanently, but for a while. To establish the memorial, to complete the podcast series properly. The kids can finish the school year here." Carmen glanced at her, a question in her eyes. "It feels right," Morgan explained, "to see this through, to help the town process what happened, to make sure Rebecca and the others aren't forgotten again. The prodigal daughter returns for good." Carmen's tone was gently teasing. "Not for good, but for long enough." Morgan smiled wryly. "Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on Jack Coleman. Left to his own devices, he'd turn the memorial into a shrine to investigative journalism." Carmen laughed, a startling, beautiful sound that seemed to surprise her as much as Morgan. "I like him," she admitted. "He never stopped asking questions, even when it cost him." "He's one of the good ones," Morgan agreed. "And Oakidge needs all the good ones it can get right now." As they stood together, watching the snow fall, Morgan felt a sense of purpose crystallizing within her. The journey ahead would be difficult for her children, for Carmen, for the entire town of Oakidge. There would be more painful revelations, more tears, more confrontations with uncomfortable truths. But there would also be healing, justice, closure, not just for Rebecca Martinez, but for all the victims who had been silenced for too long. And perhaps in some small way, redemption for Calvin Reynolds, who had failed a young girl in life, but had finally brought her home in death. Spring came late to Oakidge, as it always did, the snow lingering on the mountains well into April. But when it finally arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal that seemed especially poignant that year. The transformation of Copper Creek Station began as soon as the ground thawed enough for construction. Morgan had hired a local contractor with a reputation for quality work and discretion, important qualities in a town still reeling from the revelations of the previous months. The basic structure of the station remained its weathered exterior, a reminder of what had occurred there. But the interior was completely reimagined as a memorial space centered around a wall of remembrance, bearing the names and photographs of Frank Mitchell's confirmed victims, 12 young women whose lives had been cut short by a predator with a badge. A separate room housed exhibits detailing the investigation, the decades-long cover-up, and the eventual exposure of the truth. Morgan had insisted on unflinching honesty, including her father's role in concealing Rebecca's murder. The memorial wasn't meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be truthful. Most powerful was the central space designed with Carmen's input, which celebrated the lives of the victims rather than focusing solely on their deaths. Personal artifacts, photographs, and stories shared by family members painted portraits of 12 vibrant young women with dreams, talents, and futures that had been stolen from them. As the memorial took shape, so too did Morgan's podcast series. Buried Secrets launched in May, its first episode detailing Rebecca's disappearance and the town's initial response. The series quickly rose to the top of the podcast charts, its unflinching examination of institutional failure and communal complicity striking a chord with listeners nationwide. By the time the memorial was ready to open in early June, the media frenzy had largely subsided. Garrett Mitchell had pleaded guilty to multiple charges related to the cover-up, accepting a plea deal in exchange for providing evidence against others who had been complicit in his father's crimes. The investigation continued, with state and federal authorities methodically building cases against former deputies, officials, and others who had helped maintain the conspiracy of silence. The memorial's opening ceremony was a subdued affair, attended primarily by the victims' families and members of the Oakidge community. Carmen Martinez cut the ribbon, her quiet dignity a rebuke to those who had dismissed her concerns for decades. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, Morgan found herself alone in the central exhibit space, standing before a large photograph of Rebecca, not her serious senior portrait, but a candid shot Carmen had provided, showing Rebecca laughing, her face alight with joy and possibility. She would have been 40 this year. Carmen's voice came from behind her. I sometimes try to imagine what she would have become. A teacher, perhaps, or a writer. She loved books. I think she would be proud of what you've accomplished, Morgan said, turning to face her. Of how you never gave up even when everyone told you to move on. Carmen smiled sadly. Perhaps, though I suspect she would tell me to focus more on living and less on the past. She gestured around the memorial. This is important work, necessary work, but it isn't the end. No, Morgan agreed, just a beginning. They walked together through the memorial, past photographs and artifacts, past the wall bearing the names of the 12 known victims, past the exhibit detailing how Frank Mitchell had used his position of authority to prey on vulnerable young women for nearly 2 decades. Outside, the June sun warmed the mountains, and wildflowers bloomed in the meadows surrounding the property. Logan and Abby were helping Jack Coleman set up tables for the community gathering that would follow the opening ceremony, their laughter carrying on the clear mountain air. Will you stay in Oakidge? Carmen asked as they stood on the steps of what had once been Copper Creek Station and was now the Henderson Ridge Memorial Center. Through the summer, Morgan replied. The kids start school in Denver in the fall. And your podcast? 2 more episodes to complete the series. Then I'm considering a broader project examining similar cases across the country, instances where authority figures abuse their power and communities turned a blind eye. Carmen nodded approval. Important work, but don't lose yourself in darkness at work. And there's light in this world too, even after what we've seen. As if to emphasize her point, Abby came running up, her face flushed with excitement. Mom, Logan found something in the creek. Some kind of weird fossil or something. Come see. Morgan exchanged a smile with Carmen. Duty calls. Go, Carmen urged. Life goes on, as it should. Morgan followed her daughter down the path toward the creek that ran behind the property, where Logan was carefully examining something in the shallows. Jack stood nearby, offering expert commentary on what appeared to be an unusual rock formation. The scene was so normal, so free from the weight of tragedy and betrayal that had dominated the past months, that Morgan felt a sudden surge of gratitude. For her children's resilience, for the unexpected friendship she'd found with Carmen, for the chance to contribute something meaningful to the healing of a wounded community. The buried secrets of Oakidge had finally been unearthed, the light of truth exposing decades of darkness. The process had been painful, the revelations devastating to many. But with truth came the possibility of healing, of justice, of moving forward with eyes wide open rather than willfully blind. As she knelt beside her son to examine his discovery, not a fossil after all, but an interesting geode split by the creek's current, Morgan felt a sense of peace settle over her. The past couldn't be changed, but the future remained unwritten. And sometimes from the darkest soil, the most beautiful flowers could grow. 3 years later, Morgan Reynolds stood at the entrance to the Henderson Ridge Memorial Center, welcoming visitors to the annual Remembrance Ceremony. The center had become nationally recognized, drawing visitors from across the country and serving as a model for similar memorials in other communities grappling with their own buried secrets. Her podcast series had won a Peabody Award and spawned a broader investigative project examining the intersection of authority, silence, and justice in small-town America. The work was challenging but fulfilling in allowing her to use her platform to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. Logan, now 15, and Abby, 12, had adjusted well to life in Denver, but still spent summers in Oakidge helping at the Memorial Center and exploring the mountains they'd come to love. The trauma of that winter had faded, replaced by a deeper understanding of moral complexity and the importance of standing up for truth, no matter the cost. Carmen Martinez had become a powerful advocate for families of missing persons, particularly those from marginalized communities. Her quiet strength and unwavering persistence inspired others to keep searching, keep questioning, keep demanding answers when authorities dismissed their concerns. And Oakidge itself had changed slowly but significantly. The conspiracy of silence had been broken, replaced by a commitment to transparency and accountability. New leadership in the sheriff's department, the town council, and other institutions had begun the long process of rebuilding trust with the community. The memorial stood as a constant reminder of what happened when power went unchecked, when fear silenced truth, when a community chose comfort over justice. But it also represented the possibility of redemption, not erasure of the past, but acknowledgement and growth from it. As visitors filed into the memorial for the ceremony, Morgan caught sight of a butterfly, a monarch with vibrant orange wings landing briefly on the sign bearing Rebecca Martinez's name before fluttering away toward the mountains beyond. A coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps something more. Either way, it felt right, a symbol of transformation, of beauty, emerging from darkness, of the enduring power of truth to set us free. The buried secrets of Oakidge had finally found the light, and in that light, healing had begun.